There's so much about Marshall's teaching and his way of being that it's been inspiring for me and been a touchstone for me. The story that comes to mind is that at the IIT in February of 2007, I remember being in a session where Marshall said something like, it was just part of a bigger session, but he said something offhandedly like, well, my need for food has never been fully met. And a lot of the participants were kind of understandably like, what? Your need for food has never been fully met? It's kind of disconcerting. A lot of people were feeling confused. And he said, yeah, my need for food has never been fully met because as long as I've been alive, there have been people on this planet who've been going hungry. And it was like this profound declaration of interdependence, for me, hearing that, to really recognize that his vision of needs was extremely interdependent with all beings. And so for me, that's always been a touchstone for me in my work as an NVC trainer, but also personally, to not get kind of lost in the idea of needs being somehow this personal thing that I have and is met or unmet. I really understood from that moment. One of the things I often tell actually people who aspire to be NVC trainers, especially in this modern day and age, is that in many ways, I think he was a terrible teacher. Like he was like, he would just get up on stage and he kind of like, but he was an incredible teacher, but he was not a teacher. A lot of times nowadays, trainers think, you need to learn how to facilitate and be able to work a group so that they can learn and use all these different modalities to, help them to experientially learn. And as far as I remember, Marshall would just lecture, and he would ask some questions from time to time. The IIT handbook was full of these handouts that either he never used or were just like open questions and you would just journal. So, I kind of laugh nowadays with, I'm actually an assessor in training. So I get these kinds of questions or these insecurities from candidate trainers all the time. And I'm like, you don't have to worry because Marshall himself was a terrible teacher. You just, you're already probably much better than he was. But at the same token, we all know, he was also profoundly impactful. And I think one of the things that he had in his way was that he was very playful and provocative. Like he kind of knew and had fun with kind of pushing people's buttons to, and I think it's one of the ways that we do learn as human beings is when we have our assumptions questioned, when we and humor and play and all those things are so good at kind of opening up that space in us to be willing to hear or learn something new. And he was very good at that, as a lecturer or as an entertainer. He's very good at provoking and opening places, stimulating places for conversation and learning. A moment with Marshall that really particularly stays with me is in one of his workshops that I attended in, I believe this was Lake Merritt in Oakland. But again, San Francisco Bay Area, this would have been around 2003 or 2004. And I think the workshop was a weekend on healing emotional pain. And one of the participants in the course of his kind of role play and work with Marshall, he actually asked if the audience would be willing, the participant asked if the audience would be willing to kind of shout and say a lot of these different racial slurs that this man had experienced throughout his life. I mean, really, really harsh stuff, and scary in a way to have them spoken out loud in a public setting. But this man he was in the place in that moment where he was in the space to receive it in a way, like, I think wanting to be able to be in touch with the needs with himself and with the people saying those things to him. And I think what struck me is just that Marshall gave lots of space for this to happen. He didn't really facilitate it at all. He kind of allowed it to happen. And I think he was very he had a lot of trust for what was unfolding. And what was impactful for me was being in the audience and hearing these racial slurs be yelled, shouted, hatefully sounding, to this person. And then to watch, on one hand, Marshall just in a very calm way, quietly witnessing all this, and the participant weeping, weeping, like a life transformation of weeping, just completely shedding tears of what seemed like decades or a lifetime of trauma. And then coming out on the other end of that, and this seemed like it went on forever. And then he came out on the other end of that and glowing and full of joy and peace and gratitude. And I remember the microphone was sort of passed around people for kind of a harvest, for people to share how it was for them. And I remember standing up and saying, I felt terrified and scared, but I noticed I'm also very curious. And I remember Marshall in that moment looking at me with a kind of a twinkle in his eye and just smiling. And I remember just being very moved by the whole experience, by the level of trust he had in the process, and but also the participant, the level to which he knew what he needed and invited it and created a scenario for that. So yeah, the whole thing was very moving for me. It's stayed with me ever since.
I have actually spent quite a lot of time with him, more than 100 days, which is more than most people have. So I have this sense that I know a lot about what he actually meant and what was his dear message about peace and the inner liberation needed to be able to create peace. And his social change projects was also very often focused on how do I relate to myself? How can I bring peace to a world if I don't find it inside? So he's actually very alive for me when I'm in difficult situations. I relate to what I learned from him. And I can hear him speak, still remember his sentences. Yeah. This is also what I have seen, this direct appreciation of people who speak up, not to draw attention to themselves, but to speak to something important in the room. When people spoke up for something where it was clear there was a heart wanting to express something, I've always seen it be welcomed by Marshall. When I think back of all the empathy sessions I've seen with him, there's one that stands out. There was a woman who was there wanting to talk with Marshall about her son, who had been beaten so heavily by other young men that he almost died, and now he was crippled, could only lie on a bed. And Marshall empathized with her so that we were all in tears, and it became clear that she was from the Roma family. She's a Roma or a Gypsy and there are many situations where people from that group will be harassed by others. So her son had been beaten because of that. And then he empathized with the young man who had beaten the son. And he empathized with the son, of course, the son and the mother. And the way he empathized with the young man who had beaten him was maybe the most touching of all. How it's like he really slipped into their skin and could speak from what it's like to be them and the pain that was alive in them before doing this and during doing this and after living with having beaten another person almost to death. And the room was just so intensely full of that healing energy, and you look around and people were like almost fainting and falling asleep because it was so overwhelmingly intense. I see amazing precision and a radical approach to transforming violence into peace. That's what I see. He was radical. Very often, I and others remember his empathy skills. But preparing for this talk, I also recall a lot of situations where he showed his love for honesty, his love and appreciation for honesty in so many ways. You know, he would give people some labels like, oh, you are our crap detector, or you are the troublemaker. And it was said with so much love and appreciation. There was no doubt that this was something that he really welcomed. And I think he saw the challenge we still have in our network today of, do I dare to speak what's really alive for me? How will I be judged? Will other people understand me? Will I be excluded for having this opinion? And so I have seen so many examples of Marshall valuing, welcoming, making clear that this is something that he appreciates seeing in his work with people. And the other thing that was very visible was how dedicated he was to his loved one. Always finding time in the evening to call them, and way back in history was very difficult to get any internet connection or telephone connection, but he always dedicated time and was very eager to keep that love connection alive and live his love, which he also talked to us about, to live our love. I want to live my love for you.
So I'm like sitting on my friend's couch and I look up on the bookshelf and there's this little blue book. This is like the very first iteration, right? His first sample copy that he got feedback on. And it said Nonviolent Communication. And I'm like, whoa, I just wrote a whole philosophy of education based on the tenets of nonviolence. I'm like, what is this? So of course I asked my friends, wow, where'd you get this book? What's this about? And they're like, oh, we haven't even read that. Byrne gave that to us, which was another friend. So I called up my friend Byrne. I'm like, what is this? Where did you find this? And he goes, hey, I think the guy who wrote it's going to be in town. And this is in San Francisco. So literally then the next week, Byrne and I, like, we go into San Francisco, into this little community hall that was kind of, I remember walking down some stairs and walking in, and there's this guy with a guitar and some puppets. I was like, I'm home. This is great. Marshall was coming through doing a training over at Merritt Lake in the Oakland area, and I drove down. I was living 4 hours out of town, but I wanted to take this opportunity to go see him and deliver this message from Julie. And things were really hectic. The workshop was really starting, and and I knew I just had to catch him, and so I went up and I just said, hey, Marshall, I have a message from Julie Green. Like I just went in because of course that's what he's taught us, like, get to it, and so he just turned to me and he just went, Julie. And like we stood in this silent moment together that was really precious. Like I could feel his honoring of her, and then like both of us just in this sweetness about this person that we both knew quite well. And then after the silence, he's like, what'd she have to say? And so then I shared, and I was kind of shaky, a little nervous that I'm about to tell Marshall Rosenberg he's got to get out of his head. And I said, and she said, you probably should get out of your head a bit more. And he goes, it's probably right. Like he just kind of shook and like went with it. And Marshall was coming through town as often as the fog, so he happened to be in town. I called up Julie and I said, hey, can I just have 10 minutes with you guys? I have a couple questions. And so the way I started it out, because this is very much how Marshall and I talk to each other, we're very much into kind of ribbing each other. And I said, Marshall, it's falling apart and I have sent all my teachers to train with you and it's not working. I need to know why it's not working. The kids are threatening each other, calling circles on each other. And he goes, so you've trained all the teachers? I said, yeah, I sent them all to you. And he goes, but you haven't trained any of the students. And I'm like, you mean to be the facilitator? And he goes, yeah. I had to, oh. He goes, yeah. He goes, you're still playing in a power over power under system until the students all feel they can facilitate the circles. And I was like, Oh man, and like that changed everything. It changed everything, you know, and the first week of our school, we would train everybody up in MVC, the language of MVC, the way we would do circles, and it was amazing to see how much shifted and the power dynamic of the entire school structure. I'm not talking just the student dynamic, but the teacher dynamic, the parent teacher, like everything shifted in the whole school of like, oh, anyone who needs a circle can request of any other community member to be that facilitator of the circle. And it was mind-blowing, you know. So he was a direct influence in so many ways of what shaped my work. Well, he said he was proud of me when I gave him my final hug that turned into the last hug I would ever give him, which was at an IIT. And I actually had to leave the IIT early. And so I did, you know, I was like, what would Marshall do? I went and interrupted his session, and I said, I gotta go. And I really feel like I'm not going to see you again, and I need to hear a song. So he stopped his whole session on what he was doing on social justice or social change, and he sang me my favorite song, which is "Have you ever?" The one "Have you ever wondered?" You know, like about green jello and the dog and everything. And he sang that song, and he gave me a hug, and he said, "You know, I'm proud of you." You know, because I think as he was getting older too, and his health was starting to shift, he was getting even a little bit more fatherly with some of us.
Well, the very first time I saw him, well, it was an older video that was probably made in the 60s. And I started watching, and at that time in the 60s, I think Marshall was practicing poverty because he did not want to pay taxes to support the Vietnam War. I didn't know that at the time, but I just saw this guy who was, one of his practices was to do his own haircuts. And I think he used the bowl and just, you know, and just trimmed it. It was bad. I just I just thought this guy looks like a convict, and I don't care what he's selling. I don't want him. And I walked out. I had so much fun telling him that story years later, and he laughed. He was very human, right? And I've seen him lose it and just get really mad at an IIT when there's 70 people in the room, and he blasted a whole bunch of folks, yeah, and then cleaned it up, you know. But I enjoyed seeing that humanness in him, you know, that he was um, that I could relate to. Again, that okay, you know, this I'm a work in progress, and it appears that he is too. The local community college sponsored him and would do a weekend workshop with Marshall, and that the school brought him twice a year for almost 25 years. So I got to see him do the same weekend workshop again and again and again. But because he was such a powerful presenter and storyteller, because he would be telling the same jokes, but the timing, you just would roll with laughter. And I lost track of how many times I'd heard that joke, you know, and his stories about his son Brett and taking the garbage out, and those were epic, yeah. And so that's when I first met him in person or saw him in person. I didn't really meet him, um, other than to maybe say welcome or hello. And I remember at another IIT, my daughter was on my support team, and I was blessed with the opportunity to do a lot of IITs, and as an organizer, as a participant, and as a trainer, and the my daughter had brought a book that had been written by a friend of hers, and it was just come out, and it was a children's book with lots of illustrations, and she wanted Marshall to write a foreword to it, or some type of endorsement. I forget the exact nature of the endorsement, and he said yes, okay, and took the book with him. And this was in the first days of the IIT, and we're close to the end of it, and Marshall hasn't done it, okay, and my daughter Keisha, she corners him and says, "Hey, how about the endorsement for the book?" You know, and then he finally admits that, I don't want to do it. It's really not my kind of book. And my daughter Keisha says, "I appreciate your honesty, and it would have been okay to tell me that at the very beginning." Yeah, and again, it was just, Marshall was human, and I like knowing this humanness or seeing this part of him, because then it keeps me from putting him on that pedestal, but it makes him and the work more accessible. One of his favorite things to do would be sit around with the guys, and have a beer and tell childhood stories of what it was like to uh, avoid being beat up by the gangs, other kids after school. Again, it was something that he enjoyed doing. It's just, again, for me, it just points to his humanness. Yeah. He did not like administrative stuff. He really resisted it. I know one of the people that actually who was on the board and for a while and would attend these board meetings where Marshall would be present, and they'd be at a big table. And one time she gets up and leaves the table and comes back. And as she's coming back, she walks behind Marshall, and he's got his laptop open in front of him, and he's playing a video game. He wasn't even there. He loved to play his guitar and sing, and he would open his classes or sessions with a song. And so that's what I do now in my trainings. I always begin with a song. And one of my favorites was, he didn't actually write. There was a woman who traveled with him, Ruth Bevermeyer, and one of her songs that he sang frequently at the opening was, "I Wonder." It's "I wonder why my dog won't eat green Jello." That's the first lyric in it, yeah. And it's a playful children's song, but it really has some depth and meaning to it as well. And I like to do that to remember and to honor him.
I wouldn't be doing this work today if I hadn't dropped my idea of being perfect. I remember I was working in an international setting with codes and, meritocracy, setting, institution. And I started to share NVC like most of the time. So I left this institution. And I left this institution because I kept remembering that there's no need to be perfect to start doing something you believe in. Everything's worth doing, even poorly. Remember, that was one of his sentences. And actually, I remember that because the experience of that is not about knowing it, it's more about experiencing it. And the experience I had was when at an IIT, it was in Belgium. I was so wanting to share a remembering song, but I couldn't. I said I couldn't sing. I can't sing well. I'm off key most of the time. And he said, "Let's do it." And he took his guitar, and we practiced a little bit. And I must say, he wasn't perfect at the guitar either. Sometimes with a boom, 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 like But the experience of just seeing him not being perfect, trying to just adjust to my voice, and me trying to adjust to the song and to the guitar and to the lyrics. And it was such a delicious experience that I just didn't want to be perfect at that moment. In that moment, I just want to be me. I just wanted it to be us together. And so we played this song, and we recorded it. So I have it somewhere in the in the archives. It's not a good song, it's not a perfect song, but we sang it twice because people were so touched, and I was so emotional. I was so captured, and that was the moment that I said to myself, I don't want to be perfect. This is what I want to live. I want to live experiences, from heart to heart experience, and there give something, offer something of myself that maybe I don't like, but this is me. It's kind of learning to be authentic more than to be perfect. So this is why I'm here. This is why I change my, little by little, I change my priorities, I change my life, I change my whole world, basically. I think I was inspired by the rhythm with which he listened to people and he replied to people. And basically the rhythm he allowed us to be in a space where we could sit, we could listen to him, ask questions, and sing and dance and laugh. I mean, these are the ingredients that help me, and I guess every human being, to stay alive and feel alive, you know? And the learning is experiential. It's all about deconditioning ourselves and dropping our certainties and our perfection, and what we know about things and what we know about people and what we believe to be right or wrong. It's more about dropping all of that than learning something new.
He loved to be challenged, and he enjoyed challenging. He was interested in truth and living it, which I see at the heart of NVC. And I'm sure you've seen the cartoon of the person in a boat ready to cross a river to another shore. And he said, NVC is like the boat. You get in on one shore, you get in on the boat, and you go across to the other shore, and you leave the boat in the water once you hit that other shore. So, it's kind of one of those human paradoxes that he lived, is sharing, the boat, but trying also to let people know it's not about the boat. And, me included, when I was first learning NVC, the boat was very precious to me. I'd like to give a story. One example, we were in Rio for a IIT and a board meeting, probably the early 2000s, maybe 2003. And after all the meetings, Dominic Barter took the board and the trainers and Marshall, of course, to the nearby favela, which is, lots of poverty, violence. We could even hear gunshots from the IIT location. And Dominic took us to a woman's home who lived there in poverty like everyone else there. And she had started a school for children in the area. They looked to be like elementary school children. And so she took us through her home, showed us her school, met the children. And on the way out, we filed through her kitchen, and I was at the end of the line. Marshall was in front of me, and Marshall stopped on the way out and pulled a checkbook out of his breast pocket and wrote a check. And because I was very close to him, behind him, kind of over his shoulder, kind of standing next to him, I saw that he had written a check for $3,000 to this woman. And I don't know, that I have a lot of examples like that, not just money, but time and care. But he would see a need and try to fill it. Like his first book, he dictated a lot of it while walking in the hills behind the farmhouse he stayed in Switzerland. And there might be cowbells in the background. And Lucy Liu transcribed all that into his first book. But he was also just a human being with foibles and internal struggles and people who were mad at him, and he'd make he'd stimulate messes. And so I'd say his humanness, one little story related to that is, so we always made a basket of things to put in his hotel room. And she always said, and he likes to have, she always put a little bottle of, what was it called? Oh, wild turkey whiskey. And so like, yeah, okay. So when I kind of took over the organizing, I would always include a little bottle of wild turkey whiskey in his welcome basket. Kind of fast forward to, I don't know, mid 2006 or something like that. And we were at a IIT board meeting in Budapest. And when he arrived, he was super sick. He arrived to the IIT before he went up to his room. You know, the trainers, we were all there, the trainers, and he just checked in to say hi, but he was very, very sick, and he went to his room. And I was like, oh my God, you know, that's like the last thing he's going to need is a bottle of whiskey. So I felt a little sheepish about that. And he came out, I don't know if it was the next day or even a couple days later, because he was so sick. And he never missed workshops. This guy traveled about 300 days a year, never missed workshops, rarely got sick, probably worked through his sicknesses in a workshop if he was sick. But he was very sick this time. And when he finally came out, he came over to me and he said, thank you for that wild turkey. It really did the trick, or something like that. Like that was the medicine that really helped. And he gave me this little golden giraffe.
I was just learning that I could be angry, and that it was okay to actually have anger. And so I was finally in my life expressing anger to people. And then I went to see Marshall Rosenberg. That a few people told me, you have to see this guy, he's fantastic. And so I went to see him, and I didn't really get why he was singing. I didn't get his guitaring and singing. And I left kind of mad at him. It's like, I didn't think I could be angry in a format. I thought I just had to spew it. And so I walked away thinking, I don't know about this guy. I don't know why other people are into this guy, but I'm not into him. But then a couple years later, somebody invited me to another workshop that he did. And I kind of fell in love with him at that point. And I didn't even connect the dots. I didn't even remember my very first experience was with him until I had become a certified trainer. And I just never connected the dots. I was working for a tiny little NVC organization, tiny. And I was really struggling with this idea of being transparent. I was such a closed person, and I was so afraid to be that transparent. And so I was thinking about leaving the organization and pulling away from NVC at the time, actually very seriously thinking about it. And I was going to an IIT, and somebody suggested that I do a private session with Marshall. So back in the day, you could do that. You could go to an IIT and have private sessions with Marshall, which I think is remarkable today. But then it was ordinary. And so I asked for time with him, and I set it up. I was sure he was going to agree with me that his idea of transparency was way too open. And so I went in sure that I was going to convince him otherwise. And so I said, Marshall, it would be like me asking you on a date and saying, hey, Marshall, would you go to dinner with me? But what I really want you to know is I'm looking to get married, and I'd like to have a couple kids, and I'd like to live in Washington State. I mean, I just want you to know the whole thing. And I said, don't you think that's too much, Marshall? And he said, oh, I would love that, Mary. I would just absolutely love it if somebody would ask me out on a date that way. I mean, just think, you'd know exactly what you were getting into on that first date. And at the time, I was kind of horrified by his response. But by the end of that conversation, I was completely 100% in. Completely 100% in. And I wish I could tell you what he said. That part I don't remember at all. I just remember walking out in awe and thinking, oh, this is really hard, really, really hard for me to think about being that open, but I want to be. And so I walked out completely in and have been part of the NVC community ever since. I'm actually very grateful to him for that moment, because I really think that he saved my life in that moment. He kept me in, and my life has been amazing since then. It feels warm thinking about him. The thing is about Marshall, like all of us, he wanted to continue growing. He didn't think he had the answer and that was going to be it forever. He wanted to continue growing in it, and he wanted to be in the world. And he wanted NVC to be in the world today. Whatever today was, he wanted NVC to be relevant in that moment. He also had a really good sense of humor, and he could be playful as well. He had real genuine struggles, things that he dealt with, and he didn't always have the answers. Like a lot of us, he did his best in many ways, but he struggled sometimes. And one of the things about Marshall that I will forever be grateful for and sad at the same time is he gave his life to the NVC community. He traveled a lot, and he was exhausted a lot of the time because of doing that. And the other thing is, you'd pick him up at the airport, for instance, and he looked just completely spent. And if you didn't know him well, you might think, oh man, this is going to be a bad training because he doesn't have any energy. And he'd get in front of the group and bam, his energy would light up, and he would be his, charismatic, effervescent person. And then the thing would be over. You'd have him in your car, taking him to the airport again, and he'd fall asleep in a few minutes. So he loved presenting NVC. He loved it. And also it took a lot of his life energy to do it. Yeah, that makes me sad and grateful both. I like it that we're talking about him. I love remembering him. And I don't think we can be grateful enough for who he's been for us, all of us in our lives.